The first snowfall of December had laid a thin, crisp blanket across the lawns and rooftops of Glenwood, a quiet suburb just outside Chicago. The neighborhood was the sort of place where people decorated early for Christmas, every porch strung with lights, every mailbox wrapped in garlands. It was supposed to be safe, ordinary, predictable. That was why the shock cut so deep when death, or what seemed close to it, stepped through the garland-trimmed doors of the Christmas cottage. Eleanor Marsh had lived on Sycamore Lane for nearly 40 years. At 72, she had earned the quiet dignity of age without ever losing the sharpness of her mind. She was the kind of woman people underestimated, dismissing her as a widow with nothing better to do than gossip and knit. But those who knew her well understood she noticed everything: who came, who went, who smiled too tightly at whom, whose hands trembled when they thought no one was watching. On that frosty Saturday, Eleanor walked slowly up the steps of the newly renovated Christmas cottage, a small rental property at the edge of Glenwood. A pair of newcomers had leased it just 2 months ago: Richard Lane, a sharply dressed businessman from New York, and his much younger wife, Clara. Word around the block was that the house had been empty for years. Owned by Violet Harper, a woman who lived 2 doors down, Violet had finally decided to rent it out, saying the upkeep was too much for her alone. Inside, the living room had been transformed into a holiday bazaar for charity. Folding tables lined the walls, stacked with gingerbread cookies, handmade ornaments, and raffle tickets for gift baskets. Children darted between adults with candy canes, and a fire snapped in the brick fireplace. The air smelled of pine needles, cinnamon, and something Eleanor thought faintly medicinal. She took a seat in an armchair near the fire, knitting needles clicking as she worked on a scarf. From there, she had the perfect vantage point. She liked to say that when you gave people the comfort of thinking you were harmless, they tended to reveal far more than they should. Richard Lane was easy to spot. Tall and polished, with his expensive wool coat folded neatly over one arm, he was introducing himself with the smooth confidence of a man used to cocktail parties and business deals. Clara Lane stood nearby, porcelain-skinned, her honey blonde hair tucked beneath a festive red beret. She smiled often, but the smile was thin, like someone pretending to enjoy herself. Lovely turnout, Violet Harper fussed, wringing her hands as she hovered by the cookie table. Violet was in her mid-50s, always slightly frazzled, with the look of a woman who carried too many unspoken worries. She avoided Richard's gaze each time he tried to thank her for hosting. Then there was Colonel James Redfield, or Colonel, as he insisted on being called. Retired from the army after years in the Middle East, he told war stories at every chance, his voice booming over the crowd. "You know," he was saying to a group of bored teenagers, "back in Kabul, we had ways of telling if a drink had been tampered with. Color change, smell, the weight of the liquid. Most civilians don't realize how easy it is to slip poison into a glass." Eleanor watched him with mild interest. It wasn't so much what he said as the way people reacted. Some laughed uncomfortably, others looked away. Clara Lane's smile faltered when the Colonel's booming laugh rolled across the room. Miss Ivy Trent breezed in then, wearing a smart grey coat and a knowing smile. She taught English at the local high school. Unmarried and sharp-tongued, Eleanor had seen her at plenty of community events. Always organizing, always directing conversation, always angling for attention in subtle ways. The evening passed with chatter and clinking glasses. Eleanor's needles clicked as she knitted, her ears pricking at fragments of conversation: Richard Lane boasting about expanding opportunities in the Midwest, Violet Harper whispering about raffle tickets, Ivy Trent laughing just a little too loudly at Richard's joke. Clara Lane seemed restless, glancing at the door as though waiting for release. It was around 9 when Eleanor noticed Clara slip away. She set down her knitting, watching the young woman move quickly toward the staircase. Richard's gaze followed her, but he didn't move right away. When he did, he excused himself with forced cheer and climbed the stairs 2 at a time. Moments later, a cry shattered the buzz of conversation. "Help! Somebody, please!" It was Richard. His voice panicked. The music stopped. Glasses clinked down on tables. Guests surged toward the stairs. Eleanor was slower, but she climbed with purpose. She found the bedroom door open, light spilling onto the landing. Inside, Clara lay sprawled across the bed, her face pale, lips slightly parted. On the nightstand beside her was a half-empty wineglass. "She's not breathing right," Richard stammered, kneeling beside her. His hands shook violently. Call a doctor. Someone had already rushed to fetch Dr. Levinson, who lived 3 streets away. In the meantime, Violet Harper wrung her hands at the doorway, whispering, "Oh, dear Lord." Colonel Redfield pushed into the room, frowning at the wineglass. "Not natural," he muttered. "Not natural at all." When Dr. Levinson arrived, his examination was brisk, his expression grim. "She's alive, but barely. Something in her system doesn't belong there. I don't like it, not one bit." The room erupted in speculation. Was it the wine? Something she ate? A heart condition? Richard insisted Clara had been perfectly healthy. Violet kept muttering about the wine being just ordinary Merlot. Colonel Redfield announced in his booming voice that it looked exactly like the kind of poisoning he'd seen overseas. Eleanor said nothing, only stepped closer to the nightstand. Her sharp eyes caught the lace doily beneath the wineglass. A ring-shaped stain marked the fabric, but the glass wasn't sitting on that mark. It had been moved, subtly, but enough for her to notice. She filed the detail away. Downstairs, the holiday atmosphere had collapsed into frightened whispers. Children were hurried out by their parents. Neighbors exchanged wild theories. The Christmas cottage no longer felt festive, it felt contaminated. Dangerous. Standing at the window, Eleanor watched as the ambulance pulled up. Lights flashing red and white against the snow. Paramedics carried Clara Lane out on a stretcher, Richard clutching her hand, his face stricken. The sirens wailed into the night, leaving behind a silence so sharp it hurt. And Eleanor Marsh, quiet in her chair, knew in her bones that what had just happened was no accident. Detective Marcus Graves did not believe in Christmas spirit. Not really. He had worked homicide long enough in the city to know that holiday cheer and human cruelty often lived side by side. On Monday morning, when the call came about a possible poisoning in the suburb of Glenwood, he grumbled into his black coffee and drove out in his grey Ford sedan, the snow crunching under his tires. The Christmas cottage looked like a postcard on the outside, with its wreath on the door and twinkling lights strung along the eaves. But the atmosphere inside was anything but merry. Violet Harper answered the door, pale and anxious, as if she'd been awake all night. "She's alive, you know," Violet whispered before Graves had even stepped inside. "Mrs. Lane, they say she'll pull through. Isn't that something?" Graves gave her a flat look. "That's good news. Now, let's talk about what happened here." The living room was quiet now, stripped of decorations and laughter. Eleanor Marsh was already there, knitting in the corner again, as though nothing had changed. Graves had heard of her. People in Glenwood referred to her as the neighborhood historian, or the one who knows everyone's business. He wasn't sure yet if that was useful or a nuisance. He sat up at the dining table, notebook open. "All right, walk me through Saturday night. Who poured the wine?" Richard Lane was the first to answer, his voice tight. He looked wrecked, eyes bloodshot, suit rumpled, his usual polish fraying. "I poured it. I always pour for Clara. But I swear to God, detective, it was just a regular bottle. We brought it ourselves. Nothing strange about it." "Where's the bottle now?" Graves asked. Richard shifted. "It disappeared in the chaos. Maybe someone cleared it away." "Convenient," Graves said flatly. Colonel Redfield thumped his fist against the table. "Mark my words, detective, that woman was poisoned deliberately. Same thing I saw in Kabul in '04. Nasty stuff. Slips right into a glass. No odor, no taste. If you want my opinion, you'd better be looking hard at the husband." Richard's face flushed. "How dare you? I'll be the one asking questions." Graves cut in. "Colonel, unless you've got direct evidence, hold your war stories." Eleanor Marsh kept her eyes on her knitting, but she watched the tension rise. She noticed Violet Harper twisting the hem of her cardigan, avoiding eye contact with Richard, and she noticed Ivy Trent standing near the window, watching everyone else as if this were a play staged for her amusement. When Graves turned to Violet, she jumped. "Mrs. Harper, you own this property?" "Yes. I rented it to the Lanes. It was supposed to be a nice thing." The house was sitting empty. They seemed like such a charming couple. "Did you serve drinks that night?" Violet swallowed. I handed Clara the glass. But it was Richard who poured. I only passed it to her. I swear. And why didn't you mention that to me right away?" Violet wrung her hands tighter. "I didn't think it mattered. Everyone was rushing, panicking. People forget small details when they're nervous." Ivy Trent chimed in smoothly. "But I remember, I saw Violet pass the glass. It was right after Clara laughed at something Richard said. Poor dear looked nervous all evening. Graves scribbled a note. Richard scowled. Violet whispered, "It was only wine." Eleanor said nothing, but her eyes flicked to the lace doily, which Violet had carefully folded and set aside. The faint ring was still visible. No one else seemed to notice. After taking basic statements, Graves dismissed everyone but lingered behind with Eleanor. "You've lived here a long time, Mrs. Marsh. What do you make of all this?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "It seems to me that everyone here is terribly eager to point the finger at someone else. That's always interesting. Guilt comes in many shades." Detective Graves frowned. "And you think you see it?" "I see fear," Eleanor replied, "and fear is often more revealing than guilt. Blank, underscore, blank." Word of the incident spread quickly through Glenwood. Neighbors whispered about the poisoned wine at the grocery store and the church bake sale. Some said Richard Lane had grown tired of his young wife already. Others claimed Violet Harper wanted the Lanes gone because she couldn't afford to keep the house. Ivy Trent fueled much of it, her sharp tongue working overtime. At the library she remarked, "Didn't you see the way Richard looked when Clara collapsed? Not the panic of love, more like the panic of a man about to be caught." At the coffee shop she said, "Violet was trembling all night. She must be hiding something." Eleanor listened without commenting. She knew Ivy well enough to recognize a dangerous pattern. The more Ivy spoke, the more people believed her version of events. Meanwhile, Richard spent long hours at the hospital with Clara, who remained unconscious but stable. He avoided neighbors, and when he did appear, he seemed jittery, impatient. Eleanor overheard him snapping at Violet one afternoon when Violet brought a basket of food. "I don't need your pity," he hissed. "Just stay away from us." Violet nearly burst into tears. Retreating down the sidewalk, Eleanor saw it all from her porch. Her knitting paused in her lap. By Thursday, Graves had grown impatient with the lack of progress. He gathered the key figures at the cottage once more. Snow fell steadily outside, muffling the world, as they sat in the dim living room. "All right," Graves began. "The lab's running tests on the glass and the doily. Until I have results, I'm working with behavior." "Mrs. Harper, why did you purchase powders at the pharmacy last week?" Violet blanched. What? That was baking powder, and a tonic for my nerves. Ask Mr. Klein at the counter. He'll confirm it." Richard leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "Strange timing, don't you think? Buying powders days before my wife nearly dies." "It wasn't like that," Violet protested. I was embarrassed. I didn't want anyone to know about my debts. That's all, I swear." Graves scribbled furiously, watching her shake. Colonel Redfield cleared his throat. "If you ask me, this whole business smells like a cover-up. And I'll tell you something else, the type of symptoms Clara had. That's no accident. That's the work of someone who knows exactly what they're doing." Eleanor caught the slight tightening around his mouth as he spoke. The way his eyes flicked to Richard and then quickly away. She wondered how much he really knew about toxins. His certainty was a little too practiced. Graves pushed back his chair. "Until I know more, no one leaves Glenwood. I'll have officers checking in. Whoever did this made a mistake. And they'll slip up again." Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing Glenwood in white. The Christmas lights glowed faintly through the storm, cheerful and deceptive. Inside the cottage, tension coiled tighter, neighbors eyeing one another with suspicion. Eleanor Marsh gathered her knitting bag, her mind working quietly. She thought again of the glass, the stain, the doily, and she thought of Ivy Trent's voice, sliding like a knife through every conversation. Too sharp, too insistent. Something was wrong, not just the poisoning, but the performance that followed. And Eleanor knew she had only begun to scratch the surface. The storm had passed overnight, leaving Glenwood glazed in ice. Branches bent heavy with frozen crystals, and the streets gleamed like glass. The Christmas cottage sat under its frosted crown of icicles, deceptively peaceful, as if nothing wicked had ever touched it. But inside, the air was brittle with unease. The fire in the hearth gave little warmth to the gathering of neighbors summoned once more. Detective Graves had called them together reluctantly, hoping someone might slip. Eleanor Marsh arrived early, settling again in her familiar chair, her knitting in her lap. The rhythm of her needles made people forget she was listening. Colonel James Redfield arrived last, stomping snow from his boots, his booming voice filling the room. "If the police can't find the culprit," he declared, "then maybe it's time someone with actual experience took charge." Graves pinched the bridge of his nose. Colonel, sit down. This isn't Kabul. It's Glenwood. And this is my investigation. The colonel only smirked, puffing out his chest as he settled into a chair. He had brought a flask with him, and he poured a splash into the coffee Violet offered. Eleanor's sharp eyes noted the twitch of Violet's hand as she passed the cup. Nervousness, guilt, or merely exhaustion. It was hard to say. Richard Lane was pacing, jaw tight. Clara still lay in the hospital, unconscious but stable. He looked thinner already, the glamour of his New York polish stripped away. Every so often he checked his phone, muttering under his breath. "You'll forgive me," Richard said suddenly, "but I don't see the point of all this. Shouldn't you be testing for fingerprints? DNA, something useful. Sitting here staring at each other won't bring my wife back." Graves leaned back. "Fingerprints don't tell me motives. Neighbors do." Ivy Trent chuckled softly, adjusting the smart scarf around her neck. "Oh, I think this has everything to do with motives. People don't just poison for fun. They poison when they're desperate, or humiliated, or angry. Isn't that right, Mrs. Harper?" Violet flinched. I don't know what you mean." "Oh, come now," Ivy pressed. "Your debts. Everyone's talking. Desperation makes people reckless. That's enough." Graves snapped. But Violet was already trembling. "I only wanted to protect myself," Violet whispered. "It wasn't about the Lanes. I swear it." Richard groaned, rubbing his forehead. "This is ridiculous." Then it happened. Colonel Redfield suddenly stiffened, his hand clutching his chest. The coffee cup slipped from his grasp, crashing to the floor. His face went ashen. "God," he choked, gasping. Chaos erupted. Violet screamed. Ivy darted forward but stopped short. Graves barked for someone to call an ambulance. Eleanor Marsh, calm amid the frenzy, rose from her chair and bent over the colonel. He was breathing, shallow but steady. His pupils fluttered. A faint smell, bitter, metallic, clung to the rim of the fallen cup. "Not again," Richard muttered, his voice breaking. "Not again." The paramedics arrived swiftly this time, their boots thudding across the icy porch. They carried Redfield out on a stretcher, his booming voice reduced to weak groans. When silence returned, Graves slammed his notebook shut. 2 poisonings. Same circle of suspects. This is no coincidence. All eyes turned to Richard Lane. "Don't look at me," Richard snapped. "I was standing right here. You all saw it, but you had the most to lose." Ivy said smoothly, "Your wife in the hospital. Rumors swirling. Your reputation." Perhaps Redfield was too vocal about what he thought he knew. "Perhaps you wanted him quiet." Richard lunged toward her, his face dark. Graves caught his arm. "Enough. Nobody leaves until I say so." Violet Harper pressed herself against the wall, whispering prayers. Ivy smirked, satisfied with the effect she had stirred. Eleanor Marsh resumed her seat, her needles clinking steadily, but her thoughts were sharp. Too sharp. The second poisoning puzzled her. If someone wanted Clara gone, what purpose did this attack on Redfield serve? It hadn't killed him, only frightened him, silenced him, unless that was precisely the point. Blank, blank. Later that evening, Eleanor walked home slowly, the crunch of ice underfoot echoing in the stillness. The Christmas lights twinkled cheerfully from porches, but the neighborhood felt tainted. Doors closed quickly when she passed, blinds drawn against the fear creeping through Glenwood. At her kitchen table, she spread her knitting aside and reviewed the details in her head. Clara's collapse, the wineglass, the shifted doily, Redfield's coffee, the bitter tang she had smelled. She recalled the flicker in Ivy's eyes when she had mentioned Violet handing the glass. Ivy had been precise, too precise, as if she wanted the blame to land squarely on Violet's shoulders. And there was Richard, so nervous, so secretive, yet Eleanor's instincts told her his fear was of exposure, not murder. Something from New York, perhaps, something that could ruin him but not necessarily kill his wife. Violet's debts were real, her shame evident, but debt did not taste like poison. Eleanor tapped her fingers against the table. The second poisoning was key. Someone had taken a bold risk in front of many witnesses. That spoke not of desperation, but of confidence, of someone who believed themselves clever enough to misdirect suspicion entirely. She thought of Ivy Trent's smooth voice, the way she guided conversations, planting seeds, feeding gossip, like a playwright shaping a script. Yes, confidence could be a mask, and masks always slipped. Eventually, blank, The next day, Graves returned to question Eleanor directly. She welcomed him with tea and gingerbread, though he accepted only the tea, muttering about sugar and waistlines. "You see more than most," he said bluntly. "What's your read?" Eleanor smiled, stirring her cup. "My read is that you're looking too hard at the obvious. Husbands and landladies are convenient villains, but not always the correct ones. Sometimes, detective." The hand pointing most vigorously is the hand worth watching. Graves frowned. "You mean Ivy?" "I said nothing of the sort. But you're thinking it." Eleanor only smiled again. Graves sighed, shutting his notebook. "Colonel's stable. Doctors say the dose was small. Not enough to kill. Whoever did this wanted to scare him, or shut him up temporarily." "Precisely," Eleanor murmured. "And doesn't that strike you as curious?" Graves rubbed his jaw. "Curious, yes, but it still doesn't give me proof." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but proof has a way of showing itself. If you let people believe they're safe." Outside, carolers' voices floated faintly through the snowy streets, singing of peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Eleanor listened, her expression thoughtful. In Glenwood, peace had been shattered, and goodwill was in short supply. But she knew the truth was circling closer, like a hawk above the snow, and she intended to be watching when it struck. The days before Christmas should have been filled with music and candlelight, with children rehearsing carols in the church basement and shop windows glowing with tinsel and holly. Yet Glenwood carried a hush, a watchful dread that crept into every decorated parlor and frosted window. The second poisoning had changed everything. Where once neighbors lingered on porches, now they hurried inside. Laughter at the coffee shop fell flat. Parents forbade children from visiting friends unchaperoned. The word poison clung to the air like smoke. And always, eyes drifted toward the Christmas cottage. Blank, blank. Colonel Redfield had been released from the hospital, though his booming voice was reduced to a gravelly rasp. He invited Graves and Eleanor to his study 2 days later. His hands trembled as he poured bourbon, but his eyes burned fiercely. "They tried to kill me," he barked. "I know it. I tasted it, the bitterness, the fire in my chest. Someone wants me gone." Graves folded his arms, all silenced. The colonel slammed his glass onto the table. "Damn right, I've been digging. People think I don't notice. But I do. Richard Lane isn't what he seems." Eleanor tilted her head. "Oh," Redfield leaned closer. "I made some calls. Old friend on the force in Manhattan. Turns out Richard Lane's advertising agency folded last year. Money vanished. Lawsuits pending. And, get this, he was seen in the company of a woman. Not his wife. Tall brunette. Expensive taste." Graves scribbled in his notebook. Affair or worse. Extortion. Maybe. Either way, the man's no saint." Eleanor sipped her tea, her expression unreadable. "Even sinners don't always poison their wives." "Colonel," Redfield growled, "you're too soft." "Eleanor, the husband's always the first suspect for a reason." Eleanor's knitting needles clicked, and yet rarely the cleverest one. Blank, blank. That same evening, Violet Harper sat in her darkened parlor, hands twisting a handkerchief until it nearly tore. She had summoned Eleanor privately, unable to bear the weight alone. "I can't stand it anymore," Violet whispered. "The looks, the whispers, they all think it's me." Eleanor's voice was gentle. "Because of your debts." Violet nodded, tears brimming. Yes, it's true. I borrowed more than I could pay. My husband never knew. The credit cards, the medical bills, the house repairs, it snowballed. And then she broke off, choking. "I went to Richard, months ago, asked for help." Eleanor's brows lifted. "And did he help?" "No. He told me he had his own troubles. He was cold, cruel even, said I should manage my affairs like an adult. Since then, I've hated him, hated Clara too, with her fine clothes and her smug smile. But I swear to you, Eleanor, I didn't put poison in that glass." Eleanor placed a hand over Violet's trembling fingers. "I believe you." Violet sobbed softly. "Then why do I feel so guilty?" "Because guilt isn't always tied to crime," Eleanor murmured. "It's tied to conscience." Blank, blank. Meanwhile, Ivy Trent was busier than ever. She visited neighbors under the guise of offering comfort. But her words were blades wrapped in silk. "Such a shame about Violet," she told the book club, voice dripping sympathy. "Debts can make people do dreadful things. And poor Clara, so trusting. One never really knows what goes into a wineglass. Does one?" At the grocery, she leaned close to Mrs. Hanley. whispering, "I do wonder about the Colonel. He's so dramatic, always boasting. Perhaps he poisoned himself for attention. Stranger things have happened." And at church, standing just inside the vestibule, she told the choir director, "Richard's past in New York is darker than anyone admits. Affairs, money missing, it's practically a motive written in ink." By Christmas Eve, the town was buzzing with suspicion, and Ivy was at the center, weaving threads of rumor like a spider in her web. Blank, underscore, blank. Eleanor noticed it all. She walked the snowy streets with her scarf pulled high. Listening, watching, people had stopped confiding in each other. Yet they confided in Ivy. Why? Because she presented herself as a neutral ear, a sympathetic teacher with no ties to scandal. But Eleanor knew better. One evening she invited Graves to her home again. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. The case had become a knot tightening around him. "Ivy Trent," Eleanor said simply. Graves rubbed his temple. "You keep circling back to her. Because she circles everyone else. Think about it. Who benefits from discord? Who thrives on suspicion?" Graves leaned forward. "But why poison Clara? Why risk so much?" Eleanor stirred her tea. "Motives come in shades. Detective, envy, resentment. Sometimes a person simply wants to feel powerful after a lifetime of being overlooked." Graves sighed. "That's a theory. I need proof." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Then we must give her the opportunity to provide it herself." Blank, underscore, blank. Christmas morning dawned cold and dazzling, the snow glittering like glass beads. Families gathered in their homes. But in Glenwood, joy was muted, gifts unwrapped with forced smiles. Richard Lane visited the hospital. Emerging pale and shaken, Clara had stirred briefly, whispering something incoherent before slipping back to sleep. Reporters had begun sniffing at the story. Their vans parked at the edge of town. At the Christmas cottage, a group gathered again for supper. Graves insisted on it, though few had appetite. Violet brought a pie, hands trembling as she set it down. Redfield arrived, cane in hand, muttering about cowardly tactics. Ivy swept in last, radiant in crimson, her smile cool and knowing. As they ate in strained silence, Eleanor watched the table closely. Ivy's hands moved gracefully, serving, offering, directing conversation. She noticed who took what, who refused seconds. She noticed Ivy glance, ever so subtly, at the Colonel's glass before turning her gaze away. Later, as the evening wound down, Eleanor excused herself to the kitchen. There, she quietly examined the rim of a cup Ivy had handled. A faint residue caught the light, no more than a shimmer. She set it down carefully, her pulse steady. The game was almost over. Eleanor Marsh had set her trap in silence, and Ivy Trent was already stepping into it. The day after Christmas brought no peace to Glenwood. Snowplows carved grey channels through the drifts, but the streets felt abandoned, as though the entire town had drawn its curtains tight against the scandal now choking its breath. Reporters from Chicago had moved closer. They prowled Main Street, pestering shopkeepers, snapping photographs of the Christmas cottage. Headlines had begun to spread. Suburban wife stricken in holiday poisoning. Retired colonel nearly dies in second attack. WHO is Richard Lane. The last one stung most of all. Blank, underscore, blank. Richard himself tried to fight it, storming into the Glenwood diner that morning, his cheeks ruddy with cold and fury. A half-dozen locals sipped coffee in tense silence until he slammed a newspaper on the counter. "They're lying," he shouted. This nonsense about me in New York. It's trash." But the article was detailed. A failed advertising agency, investors suing for fraud, whispers of misused funds, and a name, Sylvia Morrill, a socialite photographed on his arm less than a year before. Murmurs rippled through the diner. Richard's voice cracked. "I loved my wife. I love her still. Whatever mistakes I made in New York, they have nothing to do with this." "Nothing." From a corner booth, Ivy Trent's voice cut through, sweet and sharp. "But mistakes have a way of catching up, don't they, Richard?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard stormed out, leaving the paper behind. Blank, underscore, blank. That afternoon, Eleanor Marsh sat quietly with Detective Graves in her living room, a plate of untouched shortbread between them. "The storm is doing Ivy's work for her," Eleanor said, knitting needles clicking. "The town believes Richard guilty. Violet looks desperate. The Colonel rants like a madman. Every voice is raised except hers. She lets others burn while she stays cool." Graves leaned forward, You keep coming back to her. I admit, she's slippery, but I need something tangible. Eleanor, a shred of evidence I can take to the lab. Not just suspicion. Eleanor set down her knitting. Then perhaps we should return to the beginning. The very first night, Clara's glass was set on a lace doily. Yes, Graves nodded. So the stain did not match the position of the glass. It had been moved. Someone shifted the doily afterward. Eleanor's eyes glittered. And do you recall who remarked upon the doily at the fete? Who pointed out the circle on Violet Harper's apron? Graves frowned. Ivy Trent. Exactly. And no one else had noticed. Which means she either has an extraordinary eye for domestic detail, or she already knew that glass had left its mark. Graves scribbled furiously. You think she tried to cover the evidence, then slipped by drawing attention to it later? Precisely. Eleanor smiled faintly. Sometimes the guilty hide their tracks too neatly. Blank, _ blank. That night, the Colonel convened his own gathering at the Glenwood American Legion Hall. He called it a community forum, but it quickly devolved into accusation. Richard Lane is a fraud. Redfield bellowed, cane thumping the floor. I've seen men like him before, slick talkers, fast spenders, cowards when the bullet comes flying. Poison fits him like a glove. Richard was not present to defend himself, but Violet Harper was, and she snapped. You sanctimonious old fool, she cried, tears streaking her face. If you're so clever, why don't you admit who gave you that drink? Why don't you tell everyone what you put in your own glass? Gasps swept the room. Redfield roared, how dare you? And Ivy Trent, seated primly at the front, leaned into the silence, her voice low and certain. Perhaps both of you know more than you're saying. Violet with her debts, the Colonel with his secrets. It would be wise if we all told the truth. The room broke into shouting. Accusations flew. Neighbors who had shared Christmas cookies a week ago now pointed fingers, red-faced and trembling, and in the midst of it, Eleanor Marsh sat in the back, calm as snowfall, watching Ivy Trent soak in the chaos like a thirsty vine. Blank, _ blank. Later, Eleanor walked Violet home through the brittle cold. The woman was shaking, undone by her public humiliation. They'll never forgive me now, Violet whispered. I might as well have confessed. Everyone believes it's me. Eleanor held her arms steady. Then perhaps it is time to stop defending yourself. Let them believe what they wish, for now. Truth does not need shouting, Violet. It only needs patience. Violet sobbed softly, clutching Eleanor's sleeve like a child. Blank, _ blank. 2 days after Christmas, Clara Lane stirred again, weak, pale, her voice barely audible. She asked for her husband. Richard rushed to her side, gripping her hand with desperation. They think it was me, he whispered, but you know I'd never. Clara, you must tell them I didn't. Clara's lips parted. It wasn't you, she breathed. It was, but then her strength failed, and her eyes closed once more. Richard's cry echoed down the hospital hall. Blank, _ blank. Eleanor heard of it the next morning, and the pieces in her mind shifted again. Clara had begun to speak. She knew something, perhaps had glimpsed her attacker, perhaps had caught the faintest scent or shadow, and whoever it was, it wasn't Richard. That evening, Eleanor stepped into the frosty night, her scarf pulled tight, and walked toward the Christmas cottage. She stood in the snow, staring at its glowing windows, at the silhouettes moving inside. The trap was nearly ready. All it needed was one final gathering, one final glass, and Ivy Trent would show her hand. Eleanor Marsh, quiet spinster of Glenwood, had the patience of winter itself, and she knew the thaw was coming. By the last week of December, Glenwood felt like a town under siege, not by snow or cold, but by suspicion. Friendships frayed, marriages strained. The church choir rehearsed in uneasy silence. Even the children sensed it, their sledding laughter thin and nervous. Detective Graves had received orders from the Chicago office. If no arrest was made soon, the case would be taken out of his hands. It stung his pride. He had promised Eleanor he would see it through. And Eleanor, for her part, had promised nothing. She simply watched, patient as frost on a window pane. Blank, _ blank. On a grey afternoon, Clara Lane stirred again. Her face was gaunt, her hair damp with sweat, but her eyes opened, wide and clear for the first time. Richard, she whispered. He was there in an instant, clutching her hand. I'm here, Clara, I've never left. Her lips trembled. The glass, I didn't, it wasn't Violet. It wasn't you. Richard's eyes filled. Then who? Clara struggled, her breath shallow. It was the teacher. Her voice broke, but the word hung in the air. Teacher. Richard froze. The nurse rushed in, shooing him back, but it was enough. Blank, underscore, blank. That evening, Richard stormed into Eleanor's home, his voice hoarse with desperation. She said it. Eleanor. Clara named her. The teacher. Ivy Trent. Eleanor's eyes flickered. Are you certain? Richard's hands shook. She didn't say the name. But who else could she mean? Clara's no liar. She saw something that night. Eleanor set down her knitting. Then the moment has come. Blank, underscore, blank. Detective Graves agreed reluctantly. If you're wrong, Eleanor, this could blow up in our faces. I need more than a dying whisper. You'll have more, Eleanor said softly, but only if you let me draw her out. Graves frowned. How? By giving her the chance to act again. He stared at her. You want to bait her? Eleanor's needles clicked calmly. Poisoners cannot resist opportunity. They crave it, as a moth craves flame. We shall provide one. Blank, underscore, blank. The invitation went out the next day, a small gathering at the Christmas cottage. To celebrate Clara's slow recovery and to reassure the town that Glenwood's spirit had not been broken. Richard, though reluctant, agreed. Violet Harper was coaxed into attending, desperate to salvage her reputation. Colonel Redfield, still bristling, insisted on coming if only to keep watch. And Ivy Trent, radiant as ever, accepted with alacrity. Snow fell thick that night, cloaking the town in silence as one by one they arrived. Candles glowed in the windows, casting the cottage in golden warmth. It should have been festive. Instead, it felt like a stage. Blank, underscore, blank. They gathered around the dining table once more. Richard poured wine with careful hands. Violet produced another of her pies, her voice trembling as she apologized for her earlier outburst. The Colonel harumphed, already 2 bourbons in, and Ivy was the picture of poise. In a deep emerald dress that shimmered in the lamplight, she smiled easily, deflecting barbed comments, smoothing over awkward silences. But Eleanor watched her closely. The glasses were poured, the doily was laid beneath the central decanter, a deliberate placement. Eleanor's idea, and as the evening wore on, Eleanor saw Ivy's eyes flicker toward it again and again. Blank, underscore, blank. At one point, Richard excused himself to check on Clara at the hospital, leaving the others behind. The conversation turned brittle. Colonel Redfield muttered about cowards. Violet snapped at him, then fell silent. Graves kept his gaze steady on Ivy, though she never once looked his way. Finally, Eleanor leaned forward, her voice calm and conversational. Do you know what still troubles me? She said. The doily. The table stilled. What do you mean? Ivy asked lightly. The stain on it, Eleanor replied. The ring didn't match the glass. Someone moved it. Someone who wanted us to think the drink had been placed in one spot when it had truly been in another. Ivy's smile flickered. Perhaps you misremember. At your age. Eleanor's eyes sharpened. No, I do not misremember, and I recall, too, who first drew attention to it. You, Miss Trent. You insisted the doily proved Violet's guilt. But how did you know the mark was there unless you'd already seen it before anyone else did? Silence fell heavy. The Colonel stared. Violet's breath caught. Graves leaned forward, pen poised. Ivy's lips curved, but the smile was brittle now. Are you accusing me, Miss Marsh? I am, Eleanor said simply. The words landed like a stone in water. Blank, underscore, blank. For the first time, Ivy's composure cracked. Her laugh rang too high, too sharp. You've all lost your senses. She snapped. I'm a schoolteacher. I've lived here all my life. Why would I harm Clara Lane, a woman I barely know? Eleanor's voice was soft, but unyielding, because she represents everything you were denied. Youth, beauty, attention, and because the Colonel mocked you once too often. You wanted them both brought low. Ivy's chair scraped as she stood. Her hands trembled. That's absurd. Where is your proof? Do you think a doily can hang a woman? Graves rose too, his voice firm. Maybe not a doily, but residues can. We tested the rim of the cup you handled at Christmas supper. It carried the same trace as Clara's glass. Gasps rippled. Violet covered her mouth. Redfield swore under his breath. Ivy's face drained of color. Eleanor's needles clicked once more, steady as a heartbeat. You see, my dear, even the smallest threads can unravel the whole. Blank, blank. Ivy bolted. She shoved past the colonel, nearly toppling him, and fled into the snow. Graves lunged after her, shouting, boots pounding on ice. Richard, returning at that very moment, staggered back in shock as Ivy barreled past him. The chase spilled into the night, footprints dark against the white drifts. Ivy ran toward the frozen river, her breath ragged, her emerald dress whipping like a banner. Graves followed, his flashlight beam cutting through the snow. Eleanor, though slower, walked steadily behind, knowing the end had already come. At the riverbank, Ivy stumbled, slipped, and fell to her knees. Graves closed in, cuffs ready, but her voice rang out, wild, broken. I only wanted him to see me, to stop laughing at me, to stop overlooking me. I wanted to matter. Graves seized her wrists. She didn't fight. She sagged against him, sobbing, as the snow fell in silence. Eleanor arrived last, her breath misting in the cold. She looked down at the weeping woman and said only, "You mattered, Ivy, but not like this." The Glenwood police station was a squat brick building near the railroad tracks. A place better suited to lost bicycles and noise complaints than attempted murder. Yet now it hummed with a nervous gravity. Reporters loitered at the edges, their breath pluming in the night air, hoping for a photograph of the woman accused. Inside, Ivy Trent sat at the interrogation table, wrists cuffed, her emerald dress stained with snowmelt. Her hair clung damp to her temples. She looked smaller somehow, shrunken, the proud schoolteacher who once presided over book clubs and parent-teacher nights reduced to a trembling figure under fluorescent light. Detective Graves sat across from her, tape recorder clicking softly. Eleanor Marsh occupied a corner, knitting in hand, her needles a steady whisper. She had insisted on being present, not as a witness for the state but as a witness for truth. Graves began, voice firm. Ivy Trent, you've been accused of attempting to murder Clara Lane and Colonel Redfield by poison. Do you wish to make a statement? For a long moment, Ivy stared at her hands. Then she laughed, a brittle, humorless sound. Statement? What do you want me to say? That I'm evil, that I slipped poison into a glass like some villain in a penny novel? Her eyes darted to Eleanor. That's what she wants, isn't it? For me to fit the pattern of one of her stories. Eleanor's voice was calm. No, Ivy, I only want you to tell us why. Blank, blank. The silence stretched. Finally, Ivy spoke, her words halting at first, then spilling with venom and grief. All my life, I was overlooked. Do you understand that? The plain girl, the quiet teacher, I kept the grades, managed the bake sales, chaperoned the dances, and no one ever saw me. Not really, not like they saw Clara with her perfect hair, her pretty smile, her husband on her arm, or Redfield, blustering and adored, telling his war stories while everyone laughed. Her hands clenched. Do you know what it's like to give your life to a place, a community, and still feel invisible, to walk into a room and vanish while others shine? Graves shifted in his chair, uneasy. So you poisoned him to what? Make yourself visible? Ivy's eyes flashed. I wanted him to fall. Just once. I wanted Clara, with her city ways and her smugness, to suffer. I wanted the colonel silenced. Because he mocked me in front of half the town, called me a spinster schoolma'am, like I was some joke. I wanted them all to know I could touch them, that I mattered. Her voice cracked, and when the whispers started, when Violet was accused, when Richard stumbled and the town buzzed, I mattered more than ever. They came to me, they listened. Finally, I was someone. The words hung heavy, raw and pathetic all at once. Blank, blank. Graves turned off the recorder. That's a confession. Ivy slumped, as if the last of her strength had drained away. Eleanor set aside her knitting, her eyes steady on the broken woman. Ivy, power built on pain is fleeting. You mattered long before this. You taught children to read. You gave lonely widows companionship. You held this town together in small, unseen ways, but you couldn't see it yourself. And so you destroyed it. Ivy's lips trembled. For a heartbeat, regret flickered in her gaze. Then she looked away, silent. Blank, blank. The next days in Glenwood were a blur. Ivy Trent's arrest spread like wildfire. The newspapers devoured it. Small town teacher accused in holiday poisonings. Envy and betrayal in suburban Chicago. Neighbors reeled. Parents whispered about pulling their children from school. The church prayed for forgiveness, though the pews were filled with anger as much as sorrow. Violet Harper walked the streets with her head bowed. no longer accused but still marked by shame. Colonel Redfield ranted louder than ever, proclaiming his survival a testament to his iron constitution. Richard Lane tried to vanish into Clara's recovery, but reporters haunted the hospital steps. And Eleanor Marsh, she walked calmly among them all, knitting bag over her arm, receiving nods of gratitude she neither sought nor required. Blank. One afternoon, Graves joined her at the cafe, exhaustion etched into his face. "You were right from the start," he admitted, stirring his coffee. "You saw her before I did. Before anyone did." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Not before Clara." She knew, in her way, the truth leaves traces, even in sickness. Graves rubbed his temple. "I don't understand poisoners, knives, guns, fists, those I understand. But slipping something into a glass, watching someone drink, waiting for them to fall, it feels colder." Eleanor's knitting needles clicked. "It is colder. Poison is a weapon of patience, of control. It requires calculation, not passion, and often, it is chosen by those who feel powerless otherwise." Graves shook his head. "Powerless, maybe, but she held more power than she knew. A teacher shapes lives." Eleanor's eyes softened. "Indeed, which is why her betrayal cuts so deeply." Blank. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Clara Lane finally sat upright in bed, color creeping back to her cheeks. Richard hovered at her side, contrite, desperate to mend what had broken between them. "I was a fool," he confessed. "New York, the debts. Sylvia, I thought I could outrun my mistakes. But here, with you nearly gone, I see it all so clearly. I don't deserve you, Clara, but I swear I'll spend the rest of my life trying." Clara studied him, weary but resolute. "You almost lost me, Richard. That's not something a bouquet of roses can fix. But, you stayed, and maybe that's a start." For the first time in weeks, she smiled faintly. Blank. By New Year's Eve, Glenwood gathered for a subdued service at the church. Candles flickered, hymns rose softly, and prayers were whispered for healing. Yet the shadow of betrayal lingered. Every glance carried the memory that evil had not come from outside but from within, from the trusted, the familiar, the overlooked. Eleanor Marsh sat quietly in her pew, hands folded. When the final hymn faded, Violet Harper slipped beside her. "You saved us, Eleanor," Violet murmured. "If not for you, we'd still be tearing each other apart." Eleanor shook her head gently. "Ivy saved you, Violet, by showing us how easily suspicion blinds us. How quickly fear corrodes trust. Glenwood will heal, but the scar will remain." Violet shivered. "How do you bear it? Seeing what others can't, knowing the worst." Eleanor's eyes lingered on the flickering candles. "By remembering the best, even in the darkest stories. There are threads of kindness, of courage. I follow those threads, and they lead me through." That night, as fireworks boomed faintly from downtown Chicago, Glenwood lay quiet under snow. The town would never be quite the same. Its innocence fractured, but in the Marsh cottage, Eleanor sat by the fire, knitting needles flashing, the flames reflecting in her calm, watchful eyes, for she knew, this would not be the last time human darkness would creep into light. And when it did, she would be there, waiting, patient as winter. The Cook County Courthouse stood like a fortress of gray stone against the January sky. Reporters clogged its steps, their cameras flashing each time the police escorted Ivy Trent through the double doors. She looked pale, diminished in her prison-issued dress, the proud teacher reduced to a cautionary tale. Inside, the courtroom smelled of old wood and ink, of history repeating itself in endless trials. The judge presided with solemnity. The jury, 10 men and 2 women, sat stiff and unsmiling. The prosecution painted Ivy as cunning and cruel, a woman who nursed old slights until they festered into violence. The defense argued she was fragile, broken by loneliness and humiliation, unhinged more than malicious. But in the end, it was her own confession, recorded and replayed, that sealed her fate. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, a hush fell over the room. Ivy's shoulders sagged. She whispered something that might have been "thank you" or "damn you." No one could tell. Sentencing was swift. 20 years in prison, no possibility of parole for 15. The gavel came down, and Ivy Trent's world ended with a thud. Blank. For Glenwood, life tried to resume its rhythm. Children returned to school, though their parents eyed every classroom with suspicion. Some whispered about moving away. Others doubled down, insisting the town would heal through sheer defiance. At Harper House, Violet opened her doors again to renters. Though fewer came now, rumors still clung to her like smoke, and her laughter rang hollow at church socials. Colonel Redfield, proud of his survival, hosted weekly dinners where he retold the story of his poisoning with embellishments that grew each time. The more he boasted, the less people listened, until even he seemed bored of himself. Richard Lane, chastened, began working honest hours at a small firm downtown. He sold his sports car, settled debts where he could, and brought Clara flowers not as apologies but as habits. Clara, once fragile, emerged stronger. Her brush with death had burned away illusions. She joined the hospital auxiliary, visited patients who had no family, and told Richard plainly what she would not tolerate again. To his credit, he listened. Blank. Eleanor Marsh walked the streets of Glenwood, knitting bag in hand, as she always had. People nodded with respect now, sometimes with awe, but she disliked the hero's mantle. She had not saved the town, she had merely unveiled the truth. What people did with it was their own burden. One evening in February, Detective Graves visited her cottage. The fire crackled, and Eleanor poured tea as snow feathered against the windows. Graves looked weary, lines deepening at his brow. "The Trent case will stick with me," he admitted, not because of the poison, or even the confession, but because it came from someone we all knew. A neighbor, a teacher. That rattles a man. Eleanor's knitting needles clicked softly. It rattles everyone. Detective. Evil seldom arrives in the form of a stranger with a mask. More often, it comes in the shape of a neighbor, a friend, someone trusted. That's why it cuts so deep. Graves stared into his tea. "You think she regrets it?" "Regret is complicated," Eleanor said. Ivy wanted to matter. In her twisted way, she achieved it, but too late. She discovered that power built on harm corrodes the one who wields it most of all. If she regrets anything, it is not her acts, but the price of being caught. Graves exhaled slowly. "Sometimes I wonder, Marsh, how you stomach it, seeing the worst in people, over and over." She gave a small smile. "Because I also see the best." Richard's choice to stay with Clara, when it would have been easier to run. Clara's forgiveness, tempered with strength. Even Violet, flawed as she is, opening her house again. People stumble, yes, but they rise too. That balance is what I keep in sight. Blank. Spring crept into Glenwood by inches. Snow melted, crocuses bloomed, and laughter returned to the playgrounds. Yet under the surface, scars remained. Parents held children closer, neighbors measured their trust more carefully, and in quiet moments, the townsfolk would still whisper Ivy Trent's name. At the Easter service, Clara sat beside Richard, her hand steady in his. Colonel Redfield dozed through the sermon. Violet Harper sang louder than anyone, as if to drown out her lingering shame. And Eleanor Marsh, her hymn book open, observed it all with serene detachment. Afterward, as the congregation spilled into sunlight, a young mother approached Eleanor. "Mrs. Marsh," she said shyly, "I just wanted to thank you. Not for what you did, exactly, but for reminding us that, well, that evil isn't always where we expect it. I'm trying to teach my children that. To look closely, but not with fear." Eleanor patted her arm kindly. "That is all any of us can do. Look closely, see truly, and hold fast to kindness." Blank. On a warm May evening, Eleanor sat alone in her garden. Birds trilled, roses climbed the trellis, and the air smelled of new beginnings. She set aside her knitting and looked toward the horizon, where the city lights glowed faintly in the distance. Her thoughts drifted to Ivy Trent. She imagined her in a prison cell, books stacked neatly, chalk white walls closing in. Did Ivy still feel invisible, even now, or did notoriety give her the bitter recognition she craved? Eleanor sighed. It scarcely mattered. What mattered was Glenwood, its wounds, its resilience, its future, for she knew another shadow would come someday. Not poison, perhaps, but theft, betrayal, or blood. Human darkness was inexhaustible, but so, too, was human light. She rose, carrying her knitting indoors, and set a fresh log on the fire. As the flames caught, she whispered softly into the quiet house. "People are capable of terrible things, but also of grace. That is the mystery I choose to live with." And with that, Eleanor Marsh, watchful, steady, and endlessly curious, returned to her chair. her needles clicking in rhythm with the heartbeat of Glenwood. A town forever changed, yet still enduring.